Excellencies and colleagues, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to this very august council on the critical question of how international financial institutions can be reformed and how their functioning can be improved to ensure the human rights and developmental obligations of member states and to work towards a human rights economy, which I believe is of the utmost importance. I think we now all accept that the international financial institutions, and specifically the IMF and the World Bank that were created 80 years ago, are no longer fit for purpose in a global economy that has changed so dramatically. The relative size and significance of different national economies have changed, and there are other major changes like the rise of private financial flows. All this has meant major inadequacies in the organization and functioning of these institutions. The sharply increasing economic and ecological inequalities around the world are accentuated, creating social and political tensions and geopolitical conflicts that are ever more intense and impacting on human rights. And even though there's growing recognition that humanity faces common challenges that require global public investment on a large scale, the institutions that should be enabling this, the IMF and the World Bank, are simply too slow, too unwieldy, and really just miserly in their responses. They do not provide anything near the required finance to meet urgent needs or to address the enormous human rights and developmental challenges. In fact, currently, global financial flows operate to exacerbate these problems. But how do we move beyond critique? There are important steps that can and must be taken to make the IFIs fit for purpose in the current context, particularly to deliver on human rights and to create the foundations of a human rights economy. I believe there are three types of reforms that are necessary: organizational and governance reforms, along with changes in the functioning and program implementation of these institutions. Second, immediate measures. And thirdly, medium-term strategies that will ensure that these institutions can remain relevant to meet likely future challenges. So let's consider first organizational and governance reforms. Right now, the voting and quotas in these institutions are heavily skewed in favor of a few rich economies. And this is no longer justified either by their shares in global output or world trade. This has really affected their credibility and legitimacy. So this must be revised to better reflect both changed economic significance in the world economy, as well as the rights of all stakeholders, irrespective of economic size. This would ensure that only large economies with relatively few people do not have disproportionate voice and power to influence decisions. So, for example, the gentlemen's conventions on the leadership of these institutions, which means an American at the head of the World Bank and a European at the head of the IMF, can no longer be justified on any grounds. We need more open, transparent, and democratic processes for choosing the leadership. The IMF's executive board should be expanded to ensure more representation from global majority countries, especially from Africa. And for important decisions, the adoption of a double majority voting mechanism would ensure that decisions have the support of both the principal shareholders and the majority of shareholders. And of course, there should be a general increase in quotas and shares to reflect the changed size and distribution of the global economy. But in fact, changes in organization and manner of functioning may be even more important than the formal governance reforms. For too long, both the IMF and the World Bank have operated within a very narrow and excessively market-oriented economic framework. We know that this has repeatedly failed in terms of resolving the problems of indebted countries and the countries facing foreign exchange difficulties. And it's unable to address the big questions that fall outside these very restrictive and unrealistic assumptions in the economic model. As a result, we have conditions being imposed that are associated with lack of development, extreme volatility, and periodic crises in many countries, as well as repetitive need for assistance. This economic model must change, take account of demand-side factors, fiscal multipliers, the impact of specific policies on employment, economic inequalities, access to basic goods and services, social protection, environmental conditions, and climate change. What's very interesting to note is that the current programs and agreements signed by both of these institutions, and really all the multilateral financial institutions like development banks, do not explicitly take account of human rights, particularly with regard to the conditionalities imposed on recipient countries. This has to change. Recognizing and adhering to the human rights responsibilities of governments must be active elements of both preparing and implementing any loan programs. For example, fiscal austerity measures like cuts in public social spending that actually operate to reduce social and economic rights should not be approved. And taxation measures should be progressive rather than regressive. Really, a kind of human rights audit of all of the programming. Even within the current restrictive framework of the IFIs, there is potential for immediate action that would significantly improve the conditions for global majority countries. One of the most obvious is the new issuance of special drawing rights, the liquidity created by the IMF, SDRs, and subsequent annual niches in line with increase in global GDP. I was a member of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board, which recommended that the IMF introduce a new system of allocations based not on quotas, because this disproportionately provides SDRs to rich countries that do not need or use them. Instead, we asked for selective SDR allocation, which would mean that only those countries that face weak external positions would receive additional SDRs. And there could be specific conditions like climate shocks, terms of trade shocks, interest rate shocks, capital flows resulting from global changes, and so on, under which these SDR allocations would be automatically triggered. Along with this, the IMF should develop its own exchange rate swap facility, which would provide support with minimal or no conditionality in case of global shocks, as well as climate shocks. This would ensure a swifter global response and provide an embryonic but automatic global financial safety net. And remember, this is one of the most important reasons for the very existence of the IMF. In addition, we are obviously needing changes in the international system for dealing with sovereign debt, a multilateral legal framework that ensures the participation of all public and private creditors in debt workouts, debt relief packages that ensure the revival of economic activity and the progressive realization of human rights. For the medium term, it's important for the IFIs to be equipped and ready for the emergent challenges created by climate change, health and environmental challenges of different kinds, in a context in which there is really a lot of geopolitical fragmentation and open conflict between nations. We need to recognize universal human rights in this uncertain and difficult context, which means that multilateral development banks need to be expanded in quantity and scope, to be more actively involved in financing for social and economic rights and development and planetary goals. Regulatory structures have to be reoriented to serve the interests of people and planet, not just safeguarding the interests of large capital. And such regulatory changes currently cannot be done because they come up against legal barriers that are created by overlapping international trade and investment agreements. So these have to be reformed. Financial regulators also need to meet stringent targets for financial asset portfolios in support of climate goals. International tax reform is another very important area. This is currently ongoing at the UN, developing on the prior work of the OECD, and it should promote fairer and more equitable tax systems to ensure that all countries can benefit in the global tax system, based on fair taxation of multinational companies and taxation of very high net worth individuals, the extremely wealthy. This is necessary also to prevent illicit financial flows and jurisdiction hopping and regulatory arbitrage to avoid taxation. All of these changes are possible, but they clearly require political will. I think the Human Rights Council is eminently well placed to push for this political will at national and international levels, which would generate the broader conditions for a human rights economy. Thank you very much.